On May 31st, 1911, over 100,000 people gathered at Belfast's Queen's Island to watch history. A hull weighing 26,000 tons was about to enter water for the first time. That's heavier than 200 fully loaded Boeing 747s. It took 62 seconds for Titanic to slide down the slipway into Belfast Lough. Workers who'd spent 2 years riveting steel plates and installing bulkheads watched their creation displace enough water to rock ships anchored a mile away. This was the largest moving object ever built by human hands, constructed in a city most people had never heard of. But here's the thing nobody mentions. Every rivet was placed correctly, every system tested, every safety feature the designers intended was installed exactly as specified. The ship that became the most famous maritime disaster in history was built perfectly. The tragedy wasn't a construction failure. It was a series of decisions made in boardrooms far from Belfast, compromises the workers had no control over. So how did the world's greatest shipyard build a vessel destined for catastrophe? Belfast in the 1850s was not a city that should have built anything remarkable. It sat at the edge of the British Empire, an Irish backwater with linen mills and rope works, but no iron ore, no coal deposits, no steel foundries. Everything required for heavy industry had to be shipped in from somewhere else. The harbor was shallow, the workforce was poor. Catholic and Protestant laborers lived in separate neighborhoods and viewed each other with suspicion that occasionally erupted into violence. This was not the foundation for an industrial empire. And yet, this is exactly where one of the most ambitious manufacturing operations in history would take root. The story begins with a young Englishman named Edward James Harland. Born in Scarborough in 1831, Harland showed mechanical aptitude from childhood. His father was a doctor, respectable, educated. But Edward had no interest in medicine. He wanted to build things. At 15, he apprenticed at Robert Stephenson's engineering works in Newcastle, learning the fundamentals of iron construction from men who were inventing the industrial age in real time. He absorbed everything: metallurgy, drafting, the physics of stress and load. By his early 20s, Harland had worked at shipyards across Britain, accumulating knowledge like a man preparing for something larger than anyone around him could see. In 1854, Harland arrived in Belfast to manage a struggling shipyard on Queen's Island, a mud flat in the River Lagan that had been artificially extended to create industrial space. The yard belonged to Robert Hickson. It was failing. The facilities were primitive. The workers were undertrained. Ships came out late and over budget. Most young managers would have seen a dead end. Harland saw raw material. For 4 years, he reorganized everything. He imposed discipline on the workforce, standardized construction methods, demanded precision where sloppiness had been tolerated. He fired men who couldn't meet his standards and promoted those who could. The yard's reputation began to improve. Ships started arriving on schedule. And in 1858, when Hickson decided to sell, Edward Harland scraped together enough money to buy the operation outright. He was 27 years old, but Harland understood something crucial about his situation. He had talent, but he lacked capital. Running a shipyard required constant investment in equipment, materials, and wages. The margins in shipbuilding were razor thin. One bad contract could wipe out years of profit. He needed a partner with deep pockets and strong connections. He found one in Gustav Wilhelm Wolff. Wolff was everything Harland was not. Born in Hamburg in 1834 to a prosperous German Jewish family, Wolff had connections that stretched across European banking and commerce. His uncle was Gustav Schwabe, a wealthy Liverpool financier who would prove instrumental in what came next. Wolff had trained as an engineer, but his real value was access. He could open doors that Harland couldn't even see. In 1861, Wolff bought into the shipyard. The name changed to Harland and Wolff. The partnership combined Harland's technical genius with Wolff's capital and social network. It was a perfect marriage of skill and opportunity. But they still needed customers willing to bet on a Belfast shipyard when established yards in Glasgow, Liverpool, and Newcastle had decades of reputation behind them. This is where Gustav Schwabe entered the picture. Schwabe had a significant financial interest in a struggling shipping company called the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, better known as White Star Line. The company had fallen on hard times and was being reorganized under a young Liverpool businessman named Thomas Ismay. Schwabe saw an opportunity. He would help finance Ismay's acquisition of White Star on one condition: all future ships had to be built at Harland and Wolff. Think about that for a moment. The entire trajectory of Belfast shipbuilding, the Titanic itself, traces back to a backroom financial deal between a German banker and a Liverpool shipping magnate. Ismay agreed to the terms. In 1869, White Star placed its first order with Harland and Wolff for a revolutionary new vessel called the Oceanic. This ship would change everything. Edward Harland had been developing ideas that challenged conventional shipbuilding wisdom. Traditional vessels had rounded hulls that sat deep in the water. Harland proposed something different: a flatter bottom with squared-off bilges that would allow ships to carry more cargo without increasing draft. The design was controversial. Naval architects in Glasgow thought it would compromise seaworthiness. Harland built it anyway. The Oceanic launched in 1870 and proved the skeptics wrong. The ship was faster, more stable, and more profitable than competitors. White Star ordered more. Each new ship incorporated improvements on the last. Harland and Wolff developed a reputation for innovation. They weren't just building ships to specification. They were pushing the boundaries of what ships could be. The workforce grew. By 1875, Harland and Wolff employed over 2,000 men. Catholics and Protestants worked side by side. Though rarely as equals, sectarian tensions simmered beneath the surface, occasionally boiling over into fistfights and walkouts. But the shipyard imposed its own brutal discipline. You showed up, you worked, you collected your wages. What you believed and who you prayed to mattered less than whether you could swing a hammer or heat a rivet. The yards expanded across Queen's Island. New slipways were constructed to accommodate larger vessels. Workshops for joinery, plumbing, and electrical work multiplied. The operation became a small city within the city. By the 1880s, Harland and Wolff had become the largest shipyard in Ireland and one of the largest in the world. The relationship with White Star had evolved into something unusual: a cost plus contract system. Instead of bidding for work, Harland and Wolff simply built whatever White Star needed and charged actual costs plus a fixed percentage profit. No competitive bidding, no incentive to cut corners, complete trust between builder and buyer. This arrangement seems insane by modern business standards. Why would any customer agree to pay whatever the builder charged? But the system produced remarkable results. Without pressure to minimize costs, Harland and Wolff could focus entirely on quality and innovation. White Star got the best ships money could build. Harland and Wolff got guaranteed profit and complete creative control. Edward Harland died in 1895, but the company he built kept growing. A new generation of leaders emerged, none more important than William James Peary. By 1906, Peary was chairman, and he had plans that would have made the founders gasp. The age of the great ocean liner was dawning. Cunard had just launched the Lusitania and Mauretania. White Star needed a response. Peary met with J. Bruce Ismay, who had inherited White Star from his father. Over dinner at Peary's London mansion, they sketched out an audacious vision. 3 ships, each larger than anything ever built. Not the fastest, but the biggest, the grandest. Ships so massive they would redefine what ocean travel could be. They would call the class Olympic. The first would bear that name. The second would be called Titanic. The third, Britannic. The question was whether Harland and Wolff could actually build them. These ships would be nearly 900 feet long and 46,000 tons. Nothing close to this size had ever been attempted. The existing facilities couldn't accommodate them. Peary didn't hesitate. He commissioned the largest gantry ever built, a massive steel framework that would tower over the slipways. The Errol gantry would become the defining feature of Belfast's skyline. Belfast was about to attempt the impossible, but they didn't know it yet. The contract for Olympic and Titanic arrived at Harland and Wolff in the summer of 1908. On paper, it looked straightforward: build 2 ships. But the specifications made clear this would be unlike anything the shipyard had ever attempted. Each vessel would measure 882 feet in length. Each would displace over 45,000 tons. The existing slipways at Queen's Island couldn't accommodate them. The cranes couldn't lift the steel plates required. Even the river channel would need dredging to allow ships this massive to reach the sea. Before a single rivet could be driven, Harland and Wolff had to rebuild their entire operation. William Peary approached the challenge with characteristic ambition. He commissioned new slipways, numbers 2 and 3, each over 800 feet long and reinforced to support unprecedented weight. The Thompson graving dock was expanded to become the largest dry dock in the world, capable of holding either ship for fitting out and repairs. But the most dramatic addition was the Errol gantry. Designed by Sir William Errol, whose company had built the Forth Bridge in Scotland, the gantry was a cathedral of steel rising 220 feet above the slipways. Picture a massive framework spanning both construction sites, equipped with cranes, lifts, and walkways that allowed workers to access every level of the growing hulls. Nothing like it had ever been built for shipbuilding. The gantry cost £100,000, an enormous sum, but it would allow Harland and Wolff to construct both ships simultaneously. From anywhere in Belfast, you could see its latticed towers dominating the skyline. The gantry announced to the world that something extraordinary was happening on Queen's Island. The workforce expanded to meet the scale of the project. By 1909, Harland and Wolff employed over 15,000 men. That's roughly the population of a small town, streaming through the gates every morning in a river of flat caps and work boots. The hierarchy was rigid. At the top sat the naval architects and engineers, educated men who translated designs into specifications. Below them came the skilled tradesmen: riveters, platers, fitters, joiners, electricians. At the bottom were the laborers, unskilled men who hauled materials, cleaned work sites, and did whatever heavy lifting was required. The pay reflected the hierarchy. A skilled riveter might earn £2 per week, decent money for Belfast in 1910. A laborer earned half that. Everyone worked long hours, 6 days a week, 6 in the morning until 5:30. Brief breaks for meals. There was no overtime pay, no safety equipment worth mentioning, no protection from the elements. In winter, men worked in freezing rain, their hands so cold they could barely grip their tools. In summer, the steel plates absorbed the sun until they were hot enough to burn through clothing. The danger was constant and accepted. Riveters worked in teams of 4, a heater who kept the rivets glowing red in a portable forge, a catcher who grabbed the thrown rivet with tongs, a holder-on who positioned it in the hole, and 2 riveters who hammered it flat from opposite sides. And they drove approximately 200 rivets per day. Each ship would require over 3 million. Let that sink in. 3 million rivets per ship. If one team drove 200 per day, you'd need 50 teams working simultaneously for 3 years just to complete the riveting. The noise was deafening. The physical toll was enormous. Men went deaf from the constant hammering. Hands were crushed. Fingers were lost. 6 workers died during the construction of Titanic alone. a number that seemed acceptable at the time. The keel of Olympic was laid on December the 16th, 1908. Titanic's keel followed 3 months later, on March 31st, 1909. From that moment, both ships began to rise simultaneously under the aerial gantry, their steel skeletons growing week by week like the rib cages of enormous beasts. The construction followed a precise sequence. First came the keel, the spine running the length of the ship. Then the frames, curved ribs of steel that defined the hull's shape, erected at intervals of 3 feet. Between the frames came the shell plating, massive steel sheets up to 6 feet wide and 30 feet long, each weighing between 2 and 3 tons. Every plate had to be lifted into position by crane, aligned precisely, and fastened with hundreds of rivets. The hydraulic riveting machines could drive rivets faster than human teams, but they couldn't reach every location. Much of the work, especially in tight spaces and awkward angles, still required hand riveting. The sound of hammers on steel rang across Belfast from dawn until dusk, a metallic heartbeat that became the rhythm of the city. The scale was almost incomprehensible. Titanic's hull alone consumed 26,000 tons of steel. The ship had 9 decks stacked above each other, connected by staircases, elevators, and a maze of corridors. There were 29 boilers, each weighing nearly 100 tons, fed by 159 furnaces that would burn over 600 tons of coal per day. The triple expansion engines and low-pressure turbine together generated 50,000 horsepower. No ship had ever required this much machinery or this much fuel. And this was just the structure. The real extravagance came in the fitting out, the process of transforming a bare steel hull into a luxury liner. White Star spared no expense. The first-class areas featured carved oak paneling, crystal chandeliers, a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, a squash court, resin, and a grand staircase that became the ship's most famous feature. The dining saloon could seat over 500 passengers beneath a ceiling of ornate plasterwork. Every detail was designed to make first-class passengers feel they were staying in the finest hotel in Europe, not floating across the Atlantic. The class divisions were architectural. First class occupied the upper decks and the most stable central sections. Second class was comfortable but simpler. Third class, which would carry more passengers than the other classes combined, was relegated to the lowest decks near the bow and stern. Steerage passengers slept in dormitories and ate in communal halls. They were separated from the upper classes by locked gates and staircases that only went so far. By the spring of 1911, Olympic was ready for launch. The launch of Titanic was scheduled for May 31st, 1911. That morning, approximately 100,000 spectators gathered along both banks of the River Lagan. They climbed onto rooftops, filled every available space with a view of Queen's Island. The ship had been coated with 22 tons of tallow and soap to ease its passage down the slipway. At 12:15 in the afternoon, the triggers were released. Titanic began to move. Slowly at first, then gathering speed. 62 seconds later, the largest moving object ever created by humans was floating in the River Lagan. The crowd cheered. Rockets were fired, but there was no champagne bottle smashed against the bow. White Star didn't believe in christening ceremonies, considering them bad luck. Titanic simply slid into the water unnamed and unblessed. The tugboats maneuvered the hull to the fitting-out wharf. 10 more months of work remained. By late March 1912, Titanic was nearly complete. Sea trials began on April 2nd. Everything performed as designed. That evening, the ship departed for Southampton. As Titanic steamed down Belfast Lough, workers at Harland and Wolff watched from the shore. Many had spent 3 years building this ship. Now it was leaving. They would never see it again. Among those watching was Thomas Andrews, the managing director of Harland and Wolff's drafting department. Andrews would sail on the maiden voyage as part of the Guarantee Group. He had overseen every detail of Titanic's construction. He knew the ship better than anyone alive. In 11 days, he would go down with it. But on April 2nd, 1912, none of that had happened yet. And Titanic was simply the largest, most luxurious ship ever built, departing the yard that created her. The factory had done its job. The impossible had been constructed. Now all that remained was for the ship to prove herself at sea. Titanic arrived in Southampton on April 4th, 1912. The ship docked at berth 44, where final preparations would consume the next week. Provisions came aboard in quantities that stagger the imagination. 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 11,000 pounds of fresh fish, 40,000 eggs, 36,000 apples, 7,000 heads of lettuce. The ship was designed to feed over 2,000 passengers and nearly 900 crew for a week at sea. Every meal would reflect White Star's commitment to luxury. The crew assembled from across Britain and Ireland. Captain Edward John Smith, the most senior commander in the White Star fleet, would lead the voyage. Smith had been with the company for over 2 decades and had commanded Olympic on her maiden voyage the previous year. But he was 62 years old, bearded, distinguished, widely regarded as the safest captain on the Atlantic. This would be his final crossing before retirement. At least that was the plan. The guarantee group from Harland and Wolff included 9 men, led by Thomas Andrews. They would observe the ship's systems during the maiden voyage, note any issues, and coordinate with the crew to address problems. Andrews had supervised Titanic's construction from the beginning. He knew every deck, every compartment, every rivet. His notebooks contained sketches and observations about potential improvements. He expected to spend the voyage identifying minor refinements. That return to Belfast would never happen. Passengers began boarding on April 10th. First-class travelers arrived by train from London, their luggage carried by porters, with their accommodations among the finest afloat. Among them were some of the wealthiest people in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, whose fortune exceeded $150 million. Benjamin Guggenheim, mining magnate and heir to a vast industrial empire. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, traveling with his wife Ida. The names read like a directory of Gilded Age wealth, concentrated on a single vessel. Third-class passengers came primarily from Britain and Ireland, joined by emigrants from Scandinavia and elsewhere in Europe. Many had sold everything they owned to afford passage. America represented a new life, a fresh start, escape from poverty, and limited opportunity. They crowded the lower decks with trunks and bundles, speaking a babel of languages, united only by hope. At noon, on April 10th, Titanic cast off from Southampton. The ship's departure nearly ended in disaster before it began. As Titanic passed the American liner New York, moored nearby, the massive displacement of water created by Titanic's hull caused New York's mooring lines to snap. The smaller ship swung toward Titanic's stern, missing a collision by perhaps 4 feet. Quick action by a tugboat prevented contact. The incident delayed departure by an hour but caused no damage. Some passengers later recalled it as an omen. Most forgot it within hours. The ship called briefly at Cherbourg, France, then crossed to Queenstown, Ireland on April 11th. 123 passengers boarded at Queenstown, mostly Irish emigrants heading to America. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Titanic weighed anchor and headed west toward New York. On board were approximately 2,200 people. The crossing proceeded smoothly for 4 days. The weather was calm. The ship performed beautifully. Passengers explored the decks, dined in opulent saloons, wrote letters, played cards, walked the promenades. First class enjoyed the gymnasium, the squash court, the Turkish bath. Third class held impromptu dances in their common areas. Thomas Andrews made his rounds, notebook in hand, observing and recording. The ship was everything Harland and Wolff had designed it to be, but the clock was already ticking. On the night of April 14th, the temperature dropped sharply. The sea was calm, almost glassy, with no moon and no wind. These conditions made icebergs especially difficult to spot. Without waves breaking against their bases, without moonlight reflecting off their surfaces, the ice appeared as dark shadows against a dark horizon. The ship had received multiple wireless warnings about ice in the shipping lanes. Some reached the bridge. Others were set aside by the wireless operators, who were busy handling passenger messages. At 11:40 in the evening, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted something ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. His words were simple: "Iceberg right ahead." First Officer Murdoch ordered the engines reversed and the helm turned hard to starboard. The ship began to swing. It was not enough. Titanic struck the iceberg on her starboard side, a glancing blow that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. To most passengers, it felt like little more than a shudder, a vibration, a brief grinding noise. Many didn't notice at all. Those in the forward compartments felt the impact more strongly. In third class near the bow, some passengers reported water already entering their cabins within minutes of the collision. Thomas Andrews was summoned to assess the damage. What he found was catastrophic. The iceberg had opened the ship's hull along approximately 300 feet of its length, breaching the first 5 watertight compartments. Titanic was designed to float with any 2 compartments flooded, even 3 or 4 in certain configurations. 5 was impossible. Andrews calculated that the ship had perhaps an hour, maybe 2, before the bow sank low enough for water to spill over the tops of the watertight bulkheads and flood each successive compartment in sequence. The mathematics were inescapable. Titanic was going to sink. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and the passengers mustered. But the ship carried only 20 boats, enough capacity for roughly 1,200 people. Over 2,000 souls were aboard. The arithmetic was brutal before the first boat was even lowered. The evacuation proceeded with terrible inefficiency. Many passengers refused to leave, unable to believe that this enormous, luxurious ship could actually sink. The boats were lowered half empty because officers feared they might break if fully loaded. Lifeboat 7 departed with only 27 people. It could hold 65. Women and children were given priority, but the rule was applied unevenly. Some men found places in boats. Some women refused to leave their husbands. Third-class passengers found their path to the boat deck blocked by locked gates and unfamiliar routes. Thomas Andrews spent his final hours helping passengers find their way to lifeboats, urging reluctant travelers to save themselves, working to maintain order as the bow sank lower and the stern rose higher. He was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting above the fireplace. He made no attempt to save himself. He knew what he had built. He knew what was coming. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15th, Titanic broke apart and sank. The bow plunged first, pulling the stern vertical before it too disappeared beneath the surface. Over 1,500 people were still aboard or struggling in the 28-degree water. Most died within minutes, their bodies shutting down from hypothermia. Or the lifeboats lingered nearby, their occupants listening to the screaming fade into silence. Carpathia arrived at 4 in the morning to rescue the survivors. 705 people were pulled from the boats. Among the dead were Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and the entire guarantee group from Harland and Wolff. John Jacob Astor perished. Benjamin Guggenheim, dressed in evening clothes so he could die like a gentleman, went down with the ship. Isidore and Ida Strauss refused to be separated. They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the water rose. The news reached Belfast later that morning. Workers at Harland and Wolff learned that the ship they had spent 3 years building had sunk on her maiden voyage. The pride of their labor, the product of 3 million rivets and countless hours of dangerous work. Ina was lying 2 miles beneath the Atlantic. And Thomas Andrews, the man who had designed her, who had known her better than anyone, who had watched her grow from a keel on the slipway to the largest ship afloat, was gone. The factory fell silent. For the first time anyone could remember, work stopped at Harland and Wolff, not because management ordered it, but because the men couldn't continue. They stood at their benches and their forges and their slipways, absorbing the news, trying to understand how something they had built with their own hands could have failed so completely. The impossible had been constructed, and then the impossible had happened. The inquiries began almost immediately. In America, Senator William Alden Smith convened hearings just 4 days after Carpathia reached New York. J. Bruce Ismay, who had survived the sinking by boarding a lifeboat, was detained and compelled to testify before he could return to Britain. The American investigation was aggressive, sometimes sensationalized, driven partly by genuine desire for answers and partly by anti-British sentiment and newspaper competition. Senators who knew little about ships asked questions that experienced mariners found absurd, but the hearings produced valuable testimony from crew members and passengers, while memories remained fresh. The British inquiry followed under Lord Mersey, a judge with experience in maritime law. This investigation was more technically rigorous, but also more protective of British shipping interests. Harland and Wolff sent representatives to defend their work. The shipyard's position was clear. Titanic had been built to the highest standards, those exceeding Board of Trade requirements in many respects. The ship had 16 watertight compartments. The hull plating was steel of appropriate thickness. The rivets had been properly installed and inspected. Nothing in the construction had caused the disaster. The inquiries examined every aspect of the voyage: the speed at which Titanic had traveled through the ice field, the failure to provide binoculars to the lookouts, the insufficient number of lifeboats, the wireless operators who had ignored or delayed ice warnings, the nearby ship Californian, which had stopped for the night just miles away and failed to respond to Titanic's distress rockets. Each factor was scrutinized, debated, and ultimately absorbed into a narrative of preventable tragedy. The lifeboats became the central scandal. Titanic carried 20 boats with capacity for 1,200 people, yet over 2,000 were aboard. This seemed criminally negligent, and in a sense it was. But the Board of Trade regulations governing lifeboat requirements had been written in 1894, when the largest ships displaced under 10,000 tons. The regulations had never been updated. Think about that. The rules governing safety on the largest ship ever built were nearly 2 decades out of date. Titanic exceeded the requirements by a considerable margin. The rules simply hadn't anticipated ships of this size. The British inquiry recommended new regulations: lifeboats for all passengers and crew, 24-hour wireless watch, improved lookout procedures. Lord Mersey's conclusion regarding the ship's construction was essentially exculpatory. The court found no evidence that Titanic was unseaworthy or that Harland and Wolff had built a defective vessel. The damage caused by the iceberg was catastrophic, but not the result of poor workmanship. The watertight compartments had functioned as designed. They simply couldn't contain flooding across such an extensive breach. The builder had done its job. The disaster resulted from a collision, not from construction failures. This verdict was important for Harland and Wolff, but far from complete vindication. The shipyard's reputation suffered regardless of official findings. The word Titanic became synonymous with hubris, with the arrogance of believing that human engineering could overcome nature. The phrase unsinkable, which White Star's marketing had never officially used, but which newspapers had repeated endlessly, became a bitter joke. Every ship that Harland and Wolff built afterward carried the invisible weight of that association. The human cost in Belfast was specific and personal. 8 members of Titanic's crew had come from the city. All 9 of the guarantee group, including Thomas Andrews, perished. These were not abstract casualties, they were neighbors, brothers, sons. Andrews in particular was mourned as a hero. Stories circulated about his final hours, helping passengers, maintaining calm, accepting his fate with dignity. The city that had built Titanic grieved for the men it had lost and for the reputation it had damaged. But Harland and Wolff could not afford to grieve for long. Olympic was still sailing. Britannic, the third Olympic-class vessel, was under construction. Orders continued to arrive. The business of shipbuilding did not stop because one ship had sunk, even the most famous shipwreck in history. The workers returned to their stations. The hammering resumed. Olympic underwent modifications following the disaster. Additional lifeboats were installed, enough for everyone aboard. The watertight bulkheads were raised higher, extending to B-deck. A double hull was added along the engine and boiler rooms. These changes made Olympic safer, but they also served as implicit acknowledgement that the original design had been inadequate. The ship that had been Titanic's nearly identical twin returned to service with visible reminders that her sister had sunk. Britannic's construction incorporated lessons from the disaster from the beginning. Her hull was redesigned with a double bottom extending further up the sides. Larger lifeboats were fitted on new davits capable of reaching the water even if the ship listed severely. Watertight bulkheads rose higher than on her predecessors. Britannic would be the safest of the 3 sisters. She never carried a single fare-paying passenger. By the time Britannic was completed in December 1915, Europe was at war. The British Admiralty requisitioned the ship as a hospital vessel, painted her white with red crosses, and sent her to the Mediterranean to carry wounded soldiers from the Gallipoli campaign. On November 21, 1916, Britannic struck a mine in the Aegean Sea and sank in approximately 55 minutes. 30 people died, far fewer than on Titanic, thanks to better evacuation procedures and warmer water. But the third Olympic-class ship was gone. The curse of the Olympic class became part of maritime mythology. 3 great ships, the largest ever built. 2 had sunk within 5 years of their launches. Only Olympic survived, sailing until 1935. But her story was forever shadowed by her sisters. The war transformed Harland and Wolff. Passenger liners gave way to warships. The British Admiralty needed destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, anything that could fight. The shipyard pivoted to military production with the same intensity it had applied to building luxury vessels. Employment rose. Those the gantries that had built Titanic now built instruments of war. Belfast became strategically important, a target for anyone who understood what those shipyards produced. By the time the armistice came in November 1918, Harland and Wolff had constructed dozens of warships and repaired hundreds more. The company emerged from the war larger and more technically sophisticated than before. But the world had changed. The golden age of ocean liners was ending. Passenger ships would still be built, but the extravagance of the Edwardian era was gone. The war had killed too many people, destroyed too much wealth, shattered too many illusions about progress and civilization. Titanic slipped from headlines into legend. The wreck lay undiscovered 2.5 miles down, its location unknown, its remains a matter of speculation. More survivors aged and died, taking their memories with them. The sinking became a cultural touchstone, referenced in countless books, films, songs, and sermons. But in Belfast, the connection remained more direct. Families remembered relatives who had worked on the ship or sailed on her. The slipways where she had been built still stood on Queen's Island. The Errol gantry still dominated the skyline. The factory kept building ships, year after year, carrying the legacy of its most famous creation. The interwar years brought new challenges. Competition from German and Japanese shipyards intensified. Labor costs in Britain rose. The global depression of the 1930s devastated the shipping industry. Orders dried up. Harland and Wolff cut wages and laid off workers. The great shipyard that had employed 15,000 men at its peak now struggled to keep a fraction of that number busy. The company survived. Barely. Government contracts helped. Subsidies kept the doors open, but the momentum was gone. Belfast was no longer the center of world shipbuilding. It was one shipyard among many, distinguished mainly by its history and its size. The aerial gantry still stood, but the ships being built beneath it grew smaller and less ambitious. The era of building the impossible was over. Now Harland and Wolff was simply trying to survive. The Second World War saved Harland and Wolff, at least temporarily. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the British government again turned to Belfast for ships. The yard received contracts for aircraft carriers, cruisers, corvettes, landing craft, anything the Royal Navy needed. Employment surged back toward wartime levels. The slipways that had sat partially idle during the Depression were suddenly working around the clock. Belfast paid a price for its industrial importance. On the nights of April 15th and May 4th, 1941, the German Luftwaffe bombed the city in two devastating raids. Over 1,000 people died. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. The shipyard itself was targeted, but survived with relatively limited damage. The aerial gantry still stood. Production continued. Workers cleared rubble and returned to their stations. The irony of the April 15th raid was not lost on anyone in Belfast. 29 years to the day after Titanic sank, German bombs fell on the city that had built her. The coincidence seemed almost supernatural, as if the ship's ghost had returned to haunt its birthplace. But there was no time for superstition. The war demanded production, and Harland and Wolff delivered. By the end of the war, the shipyard had built 6 aircraft carriers, 2 cruisers, and over 130 other vessels. It had repaired thousands more. The company emerged from the conflict with updated facilities, experienced workers, and a reasonable expectation that peacetime orders would sustain the momentum. That expectation proved optimistic. The post-war world belonged to different industries. Shipbuilding remained important, but the center of gravity was shifting. Japan and Germany, their industries rebuilt with modern equipment and techniques, began to undercut British yards on price. South Korea emerged as a shipbuilding power. Countries that had imported vessels before the war now built their own. The global market expanded, but Britain's share of it shrank year after year. Harland and Wolff faced additional challenges specific to Northern Ireland. The region's sectarian tensions, which had simmered throughout the shipyard's history, exploded into open conflict during the Troubles beginning in the late 1960s. Belfast became synonymous with car bombs, riots, military occupation. Foreign investment dried up. Skilled workers emigrated. The violence rarely touched the shipyard directly, but it poisoned the broader economy and made Belfast an unattractive location for any business that could operate elsewhere. The British government kept Harland and Wolff alive through subsidies and nationalization. In 1975, the shipyard was taken into public ownership as part of a broader restructuring of British industry. The goal was modernization, new equipment, streamlined processes, competitive costs. The reality was a slow, managed decline. Ships were still built, but fewer each year. The workforce shrank from over 10,000 in the early 1960s to under 4,000 by the 1980s. The numbers tell the story of an industry bleeding out. The yard's final decades produced an eclectic mix of vessels: oil tankers during the energy crisis of the 1970s, bulk carriers for international trade, a few cruise ships, echoing the luxury liner heritage but on a much smaller scale. Each contract was celebrated as proof that Harland and Wolff remained viable. that the skills accumulated over 150 years still mattered, but the trajectory was unmistakable. The shipyard was dying. Privatization came in 1989. The Olsen family, Norwegian shipping magnates, purchased Harland and Wolff with promises of investment and revival. For a time, orders improved. The yard won contracts for ferry vessels and specialized ships. Employment stabilized, but the fundamental economics hadn't changed. Building ships in Belfast remained more expensive than building them in Asia. Every contract required subsidies or special arrangements. The business model depended on advantages that no longer existed. The gantry, which had defined Belfast's skyline for almost a century, was demolished in 1969. The structure that had towered over Titanic's construction, that had symbolized the city's industrial ambition, was simply too old and too expensive to maintain. In its place rose two massive yellow cranes, nicknamed Samson and Goliath, visible for miles. They became the new symbols of Queen's Island. These cranes could lift heavier loads than the gantry ever could, but they presided over a diminished operation. The factory was shrinking. The discovery of Titanic's wreck in 1985 briefly renewed global interest in the shipyard that had built her. Robert Ballard's expedition found the ship lying in two pieces on the ocean floor. Her bow section remarkably intact, her stern a debris field of twisted metal. Images of the wreck appeared on front pages worldwide. Documentaries were filmed. Books were written. A new generation learned the story of the disaster. And some of them wondered about the factory that had built the doomed vessel. But nostalgia did not translate into orders. The world wanted to remember Titanic. It did not want to buy ships from Belfast. Harland and Wolff continued its slow contraction through the 1990s. Workers retired and were not replaced. Skills were lost. The institutional knowledge accumulated over generations dissipated as the men who held it aged out of the workforce. The yard completed its last ship in 2003. She was a ferry called MV Anvil Point, built for the British Ministry of Defense. The launch was quiet, almost perfunctory. No 100,000 spectators lined the banks. No rockets were fired. The vessel slid into the water and was towed away. 147 years of continuous shipbuilding at Queen's Island came to an end. What remained was real estate, acres of waterfront property in a city desperate for redevelopment. The slipways where Titanic and Olympic had been built were still there, their outlines marked in the concrete. The Thompson graving dock remained intact. The buildings that had housed drawing offices and workshops stood empty, their windows dark, their purposes extinct. Developers saw opportunity. The Troubles had ended with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Belfast was rebranding itself as a modern European city, eager to move beyond its violent history. The shipyard site, now called the Titanic Quarter, represented the largest waterfront regeneration project in Europe. Apartments rose on land where workers had once riveted steel plates. Office buildings replaced workshops. A film studio occupied former industrial space. But the centerpiece of the redevelopment was something stranger. Something that acknowledged what had been lost, even as it celebrated transformation. Belfast decided to build a monument to the ship that had sunk, to the disaster that had haunted the city for a century, to the factory that had closed. The Titanic Belfast Museum would tell the story that the city had long preferred to forget. The factory that built the impossible would become a tourist attraction. Its legacy preserved in exhibits and artifacts and carefully curated narratives. Titanic Belfast opened on March 31, 2012. Exactly 103 years after the ship's keel was laid on the same spot. The building itself is a statement. 4 angular prows clad in silver aluminum panels meant to evoke the hulls of ships. At its peak, the structure rises to the same height as Titanic's bow. The museum cost £97 million to build, a fraction of what the ships constructed here once generated, but an enormous investment for a city still recovering from decades of conflict. Inside, visitors move through 9 galleries tracing the story from Belfast's industrial rise through the disaster and its aftermath. There are reconstructions of the ship's cabins and public rooms. Interactive displays explain the engineering challenges. A dark ride carries visitors through mock-up construction scenes, complete with sounds of hammering and the heat of forges. The experience is polished, carefully designed to evoke wonder without dwelling too long on death. The gift shop sells Titanic-branded merchandise, tea towels, keychains, replicas of the grand staircase clock. More than 800,000 people visited in the museum's first year. They came from across the world, drawn by the enduring fascination with a ship that sank over a century ago. Think about that for a moment. The disaster that once shamed Belfast had become its greatest tourist attraction. The city that preferred not to speak of Titanic for generations now celebrates the connection on bus advertisements, hotel marquees, and souvenir postcards. You walk outside the museum and you can stand on the original slipways. The concrete still bears the outline of Titanic and Olympic, etched in bronze to show exactly where each ship rested during construction. Interpretive signs explain what happened here. How 15,000 men worked beneath the aerial gantry to assemble the largest moving objects ever built. The Thompson Dock remains nearby, its massive walls a reminder of the infrastructure required to service vessels of this size. You can descend into the dock on guided tours and stand where Titanic once floated, surrounded by the same stonework that her hull once pressed against. Samson and Goliath still dominate the skyline, those twin yellow cranes visible from miles away. They are protected landmarks now, symbols of Belfast's industrial heritage, even though the shipyard they served has essentially ceased operations. Harland and Wolff still exists as a corporate entity, but it no longer builds ships. The company pivoted to offshore wind turbines and structural steel, trying to repurpose the skills and facilities developed over 150 years for industries that might actually survive the 21st century. Whether this transformation will succeed remains uncertain. The workforce that once numbered 15,000 has dwindled to a few hundred. The men who built Titanic, who riveted her plates and fitted her engines and watched her sail away, have been dead for decades. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren work in offices and tech companies and service industries. Belfast's economy has diversified. It moved beyond the heavy manufacturing that defined it for so long. The city is cleaner, safer, and more prosperous than during the worst years of the Troubles. But something has been lost that cannot be recovered. What remains is memory, institutionalized and monetized but real. The slipways are still there. The dock is still there. The museum tells the story to anyone willing to pay admission. And every year, on April 15th, some people in Belfast pause to remember what happened on that night in 1912. When the ship their city built struck an iceberg and sank, taking 1,500 souls with it. The legacy of Harland and Wolff extends beyond Titanic. Though that disaster inevitably overshadows everything else, the shipyard built over 1,500 vessels across its history. It pioneered construction techniques that influenced shipbuilding worldwide. It provided employment for generations of Belfast families, creating a working-class culture centered on skill and craft and physical labor. The company's decline reflected broader forces: the globalization of manufacturing, the shift of economic power from Europe to Asia, the obsolescence of industries that once seemed permanent. Belfast was not unique in losing its shipyards. Glasgow, Liverpool, Newcastle all saw their maritime industries collapse. But Belfast was unique in having built the most famous ship in history and in having that ship sink so spectacularly on her maiden voyage. That singular event transformed a successful industrial operation into a symbol of hubris, a cautionary tale about the limits of human ambition. Every documentary about Titanic, every film, every book, every museum exhibit reinforces the association. Belfast built the impossible, and the impossible sank. The story contains a particular irony that the original builders would have appreciated. Harland and Wolff constructed Titanic to the highest standards of the era, incorporating safety features that exceeded contemporary requirements. The ship was not shoddy. It was not defective. The official inquiries cleared the builders of responsibility, but none of that mattered to history. The name Titanic became synonymous with catastrophic failure, and the factory that built her could never fully escape that shadow. Stand on the slipways today and look out at Belfast Lough, the same waters where Titanic floated for the first time in May 1911. The view has changed. The gantry is gone. The cranes stand idle more often than not. Apartment buildings rise where workshops once stood, but the water is the same water, flowing out to the Irish Sea and eventually to the Atlantic, where the ship lies broken on the ocean floor 2.5 miles down. The factory that built the impossible exists now only as heritage, a story told to tourists, a museum artifact. The skills that created Titanic have dispersed into other industries or disappeared entirely. No one alive remembers Edward Harland or Gustav Wolff or Thomas Andrews or the thousands of workers who turned designs into steel and steel into ships. They exist in photographs and documents, in the fading memories of descendants who heard stories passed down through generations. What endures is the wreck itself. We were preserved by cold and pressure and darkness in a place humans can barely reach. Titanic lies where she fell, her bow section relatively intact, her stern scattered across a debris field, her interiors colonized by rust-eating bacteria that are slowly consuming what remains. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable became the most famous sunken ship in history, and the factory that built her became a monument to its own extinction. This is the final irony. Belfast spent generations trying to forget Titanic, embarrassed by the association with disaster. Then the city realized that the disaster was the only thing the world remembered about Belfast at all. So they built a museum on the very spot where the ship was constructed, turned tragedy into tourism, and discovered that people will pay money to contemplate catastrophe. The factory that built the impossible became a shrine to impossibility itself, a place where visitors come to marvel at ambition and mourn its consequences. The slipways still mark where Titanic rested. The outlines are there in the concrete, exactly where she lay for 3 years while 15,000 men hammered and riveted and sweated to build something the world had never seen. That outline is all that remains now. The ship is gone. The workers are gone. The industry is gone. Only the shape persists, a ghost traced in bronze and stone, marking the place where the impossible was built before it sailed away and sank forever beneath the Atlantic waves.